I raised my daughter alone for 27 years, believing love would teach her loyalty. But on her wedding night, in front of 600 silent guests, her father-in-law walked to my table and threw a crystal glass of ice water into my face. My daughter stood close enough to see everything and said nothing. I slowly wiped my cheek, placed the $2,000 back on the table, and walked out without a word. Then what happened next made his face turn pale. Thank you for being here with me today. It means more than you know. Drop your city or country in the comments below. I read every single one. And if this story is speaking to you already, like and subscribe so you never miss what comes next. A quick note, some elements of this story have been shaped for storytelling impact. Any resemblance to actual people or places is coincidental, but the lesson inside it is absolutely worth keeping. I have built things my entire life. Poured concrete in January when the ground was frozen solid, and the foreman told us to keep moving or go home. Framed walls in August heat that turned the job site into something close to an oven. Signed contracts in boardrooms where the other men wore suits that cost more than my truck, and smiled at them across polished tables, while they assumed the rough hands folded in my lap were the hands of someone who worked for people like them. I had never minded the assumption. I had in fact spent 15 years cultivating it. But standing at the entrance of the Grand Harrington Hotel's main ballroom on a Saturday evening in March, watching 600 of New York's most powerful people move through a space that cost more to decorate for one night than most families earned in a year, I felt the weight of that cultivated invisibility press against my chest in a way it never had before. Because somewhere in the middle of all that light and money and self-congratulation, my daughter was dancing. I found Arabella without looking for her, the way you always find the face you have spent 27 years memorizing. She was near the center of the floor, her ivory gown catching the chandelier light, like it had been designed specifically for that purpose. Her head tilted back in laughter at something Bradley had said close to her ear. She looked radiant. She looked untouchable. She looked like a woman who had spent her whole life waiting to arrive somewhere exactly like this and had finally completely made it. My chest tightened so hard it took my breath away. I adjusted the lapel of my rented tuxedo. The shoulders were a full inch too wide. The fabric stiff in the way cheap formal wear is always stiff, like it is reminding you it does not actually belong to you, and made my way inside. The seating card directed me to table 12. I did not need to ask anyone where it was. Table 12 occupied the farthest corner of the ballroom, pressed against the wall beside the service corridor entrance. Every 30 seconds, a kitchen door swung open, and a waiter pushed through with a loaded tray, the door's edge catching the back of my chair with a dull, rhythmic thud. The tablecloth was plain white linen, no gold runners, no centerpiece, no candles. Every other table in the room shimmered under arrangements of white peonies and imported silk. Table 12 had a water pitcher and a bread basket that someone had already picked through. I sat down and placed my hands flat on the table. I thought about May Holloway, my neighbor of 19 years, who had knocked on my door that afternoon while I was fighting with my tie in the bathroom mirror. She had taken one look at me, the rented jacket, the careful way I was holding my breath, the thing I was trying not to show on my face, and her eyes had gone soft and worried in equal measure. "You don't have to go, Silas," she had said. "Yes, I do," I had told her. "She's my daughter. It's her wedding day." May had pressed her lips together and nodded the way she did when she disagreed with someone too much to argue and loved them too much to push. "Call me when you get home," she had said, "no matter what time." Now, watching Arabella float across the dance floor on her husband's arm, I understood why May had looked at me the way she had. Bradley Beaumont was laughing too loudly at his own jokes, one hand resting at the small of Arabella's back, with the easy ownership of a man who had never once questioned whether he deserved what he held. At 31 years old, he had his father's jawline and his father's posture, and his father's absolute certainty that the world had been arranged for his specific convenience. His father, Edmund, held court near the head table among a cluster of men in dark suits, federal judges, I suspected, or the kind of real estate developers who kept federal judges on speed dial. Edmund Beaumont was 64 years old and carried himself like a man who had personally invented wealth and was quietly disappointed that others had been allowed to imitate it. His silver hair was swept back with the precision of a man who understood that appearance was infrastructure. His eyes moved across the room in slow, deliberate arcs, the eyes of someone checking the borders of territory he had decided was his. Those eyes found Table 12. Found me. The warmth drained out of Edmund's face the way heat leaves a room when a window opens in winter, not dramatically, not all at once, but completely, and with a chill that arrived faster than expected. He held my gaze for 3 full seconds. Then he said something to the prone beside him, excused himself with a practiced nod, and began making his way through the crowd in my direction. In his right hand, held loosely at his side, was a crystal glass filled to the rim with ice water. My hands on the table did not move. My breathing did not change. But something deep in my chest began to hum with the low, patient attention of a man who has been in enough difficult rooms to know when one is about to become considerably more difficult. Edmund stopped in front of Table 12 and looked down at me the way a man looks at a stain on an expensive carpet, not with rage, not yet, but with the particular offended bewilderment of someone who cannot understand how the stain got there and is already deciding who to blame. He did not offer his hand. He did not nod. He simply stood there above me, with 64 years of inherited authority pressing down from his shoulders like a physical weight, and let the silence make his first point for him. "Strathmore," he said finally. His voice was smooth and unhurried, and pitched precisely loud enough for the 3 nearest tables to hear without appearing to try. "I have to say, I'm genuinely surprised you're still here." Edmund did not raise his voice. That was the thing I remembered most clearly afterward, how quiet he kept it, how controlled, how every word landed with the practiced weight of a man who understood that cruelty delivered softly carries farther than cruelty delivered at a shout. "Look around you, Strathmore," he said, gesturing with his free hand at the room behind him. The chandeliers, the silk, the 600 guests who represented the upper architecture of New York power. Real estate developers, federal judges, 3 sitting senators, 2 former ambassadors. His eyes came back to me, moving slowly down the rented tuxedo, the 2 wide shoulders, the plain white shirt. "And then there is Table 12. He said it the way you say the name of something that should not exist. You are making this evening smaller simply by occupying space in it. I want you gone before the photographers begin their rounds, quietly, without a scene." My jaw tightened until I could feel it in my back teeth. I kept my hands flat on the table and my voice level, and looked up at him with the specific stillness of a man who has spent 60 years deciding which battles to fight in public. "I'm waiting for the father-daughter dance, Edmund," I said. "I'll leave when my daughter leaves." Something moved behind his eyes. Not anger, anger would have been simpler. It was something colder than anger, more calculated. The look of a man who has just decided to stop asking. He stepped forward. His free hand came down on my shoulder, heavy, contemptuous, the grip of a man demonstrating ownership rather than offering comfort. And in the same motion, so smooth and so practiced that I almost missed it, his fingers found the breast pocket of my rented jacket and pushed something inside. Something small, something hard. I felt the faint weight of it settle against my chest before his hand had even lifted away. He stepped back, straightened his cuffs, and then his voice came out sharp and carrying and perfectly calibrated to reach every table within 30 feet. "Security!" He pointed at me with two fingers like a man identifying something that needed to be removed. "This man just reached into my jacket and took my watch. I want him searched. Right now." The effect was immediate and total. The jazz quartet stopped mid-phrase. The conversations around us died in a ripple of sudden silence that spread outward across the ballroom like a stone dropped in still water. Heads turned, chairs scraped, and from the far side of the room, two men in black suits were already moving toward table 12 with the brisk professional urgency of people paid to make problems disappear. I stood up slowly. Not because I was afraid, not because I was going to run. I stood because I was not going to be searched while sitting down like a man who had already been convicted of something. My legs felt strange, not weak but deliberate, like every movement required a conscious decision that it usually did not. The first guard reached me before I had fully straightened. He was broad-shouldered and blank-faced and absolutely certain of his role in this situation. "Sir, I need to ask you to empty your pockets." I reached into my breast pocket. My fingers closed around the watch. I pulled it out slowly, a Rolex. Datejust gold case, the kind of watch that cost more than most people's cars, and held it up between my thumb and forefinger so that everyone standing in that widening circle of spectators could see it with complete clarity. The guard took it, said nothing. Edmund spread his hands in a gesture of theatrical regret, turning slightly to include the nearest tables in his performance. I gave this man every opportunity to leave with his dignity intact. He announced, his voice warm with manufactured sorrow. "This is the result of misplaced generosity." The laughter that moved through the crowd was soft and uncomfortable, and happened anyway. My eyes were burning. Not from shame, from something older than shame, and hotter at its center, the specific searing pain of a man who has sacrificed 15 years of his real identity to protect someone who is currently standing 20 feet away and has not said a single word in his defense, because Arabella was there. She had been there since the moment Edmund's voice rang out. I could see her from where I stood, her champagne flute frozen halfway to her lips, her face doing that thing it did when she had already decided something and was waiting for the moment to execute the decision. Her chin was trembling. A single tear had broken over her lower lash line and was tracking down her cheek with quiet speed. She knew the truth. She had always known the truth about me. I looked at my daughter across the width of that silent ballroom, and I felt my heart open up with a hope so sudden and so desperate it almost hurt more than the humiliation, because she was walking toward me. She was gathering the layers of her ivory gown and moving through the crowd in my direction, and for one full second I believed she was coming to say what needed to be said, to do what she had always been capable of doing, to be the person I had spent 27 years raising her to be. She stopped 3 feet in front of me, reached out, and took the folded stack of bills from Bradley's waiting hand, $2,000 in crisp hundreds pressed together with the neat efficiency of something that had been prepared in advance. Her eyes met mine for just a fraction of a second. In that fraction, I saw the war. I saw it clearly and completely, and it broke something in me that I had not known was still capable of breaking. Then she dropped her gaze to somewhere past my left shoulder and pressed the money into my open palm. "Please, Dad." Her voice was barely above a whisper scraped hollow, the sound of someone using the last reserves of something they had been spending all evening. "Just take it and go home. You're embarrassing me in front of my husband's family. Please just go." The bills sat in my hand. I looked down at them. Then I looked at the tear still wet on her cheek, at the way her shoulders were shaking, with a trembling she was working so hard to contain, at the $2,000 in my palm that was supposed to be a solution to something that money had never been able to touch. I placed the bills on the table, every one of them, carefully, without a word. Then I turned and walked toward the door. The lobby of the Grand Harrington was quieter than the ballroom cooler too, with the kind of climate-controlled stillness that expensive hotels maintain like a point of professional pride. I pushed through the ballroom doors and stopped, not because I wanted to stop, because my legs, which had carried me across that marble floor with perfect steadiness for the last 4 minutes, suddenly required a moment to remember what they were for. I pressed one hand against the wall beside the door and stood there breathing slow, deliberate breaths, the kind you take when you are determined not to let your body do something your mind has already decided against. The $2,000 were still on the table behind me. I had not taken them. I would not take them. Not because of pride. I had spent 60 years making peace with what pride cost and what it was worth, but because taking that money would have meant accepting the story Edmund had written for me tonight. The broke old man, the embarrassing footnote, the father who got paid to disappear from his daughter's life. I was not that man. I had never been that man. And the fact that 600 people in that room currently believed otherwise was a problem I intended to address. Just not tonight. I straightened up from the wall and moved toward the front desk, where a young woman in a navy blazer handed back my valet ticket without making eye contact. I did not blame her. I was a damp man in a ruined rented jacket collecting a truck ticket in the middle of a black tie event, and neither of us had anything useful to say about that. The night air outside hit me the moment I stepped through the revolving door, cold and sharp, smelling of exhaust and March concrete. The specific outdoor smell of a city that did not care what had just happened to anyone inside any of its buildings. I stood on the sidewalk for a moment and let it settle against my face. The ice water had dried into the collar of my jacket. My cheekbones still ached faintly. The cold felt like the first honest thing I had encountered all evening. The valet brought the truck around in 4 minutes. He did not look at it the way the attendants usually looked at it, with the practiced indifference of people paid to handle things they consider beneath them. He looked at it and looked at me and handed over the keys without a word, which I appreciated more than I would have been able to explain. I got in, pulled out of the valet lane onto the street. The city at this hour was still moving yellow cabs cutting lanes, a delivery truck double parked on the corner, a group of people in evening wear spilling out of a restaurant 2 blocks up. Everything functioning exactly as it always had. The Grand Harrington Hotel was already behind me, already shrinking in the rearview mirror into just another lit facade among the lit facades of Midtown Manhattan. I was at the first red light on 59th Street when my phone buzzed on the passenger seat. I glanced at the screen without picking it up. A message from Daniel Mercer, time-stamped 3 minutes ago. Arrived at the venue. Saw you leaving. I won't be signing anything tonight. Call me when you're ready. 14 words. No questions. No request for explanation. No suggestion that perhaps there was a way to salvage the evening or separate the business from whatever had clearly just occurred in that ballroom. Just 14 words from a man who had worked alongside me for 15 years and understood without being told that some things did not require discussion. The light changed. I set the phone face down on the seat and drove. Edmund Beaumont had been counting on Daniel's signature tonight. He had built the entire architecture of his private equity pitch around it, the $100 million commitment that would demonstrate investor confidence and unlock the next phase of what he believed was his company's recovery. He had planned this evening for weeks. He had sent invitations on embossed cardstock. He had reserved the plaza's largest ballroom. He had stood at a crystal podium and poured ice water on the face of a man he considered irrelevant. He had no idea that the man he considered irrelevant happened to be Daniel Mercer's employer. He would find out in the morning. The call would come from someone on his team, confused and apologetic, reporting that Mr. Mercer had departed without signing and was not returning calls. Edmund would spend the next several hours constructing theories, a miscommunication, a scheduling conflict, a last-minute due diligence concern. He would not arrive at the correct answer because the correct answer would require him to know something about me that he did not know and had not thought to find out. Tonight, he could have his party. I drove the rest of the way home in the specific quality of silence that settles over a man when something has ended that he was not entirely prepared to have end. Not grief exactly, not relief exactly, but the particular weight of a door closing behind you in a room you spent a long time trying to leave. The streets of Queens at this hour were half empty and familiar. I knew every block of this drive. I had made it 1,000 times in rain and heat, and the particular cold of late winter nights when the temperature drops fast and the city goes quiet earlier than usual. I knew which lights ran long and which ones you could catch if you timed it right. I had spent 15 years coming home to this neighborhood in a truck that cost $4,000 because it was the truck a man in my position was supposed to drive. I turned into my street and parked in the driveway. The porch light was on. I had left it on the habit of a man who had spent too many years arriving home to a dark house and had decided somewhere along the way that the light cost less than the feeling of coming back to nothing. I sat in the truck for a moment with the engine off. The rented tuxedo was ruined. The collar of the jacket was stiff where the ice water had dried into the fabric, and there was a faint discoloration along the lapel that no dry cleaner was going to touch. My cheekbone still carried a dull ache where the ice had struck. Across the city, my daughter was likely still at her reception, dancing, toasting, accepting congratulations from 600 people who had watched her press money into her father's hand and send him away. I got out of the truck, went inside, and did not turn on the lights. But the truth is, I did not make it out of that building without a fight. Before I ever reached the street that night, before the quiet drive home, before the kitchen, and the safe and the phone call that changed everything. There was the parking garage. I had collected my ticket from the front desk and was crossing the lobby toward the parking garage elevator when I heard the ballroom doors hit the wall behind me. Not open hit, the sound of someone moving fast and not caring what they knocked into. The garage beneath the Grand Harrington was the kind of space that amplified everything: low ceilings, cement pillars, the squeal of tires on polished concrete, bouncing sound from every direction at once. I had found my truck last in the row, parked beside a pillar, sitting between a black Porsche and a silver Mercedes like a sentence that did not belong in the paragraph, and had my keys out when I heard the stairwell door slam open behind me. Bradley's hand came down on my shoulder before I could turn around. He spun me hard, both hands full weight, the way you handle something you are not worried about breaking. My back hit the driver's side door, and I felt the handle press into my spine, sharp and cold through the thin fabric of the rented jacket. Bradley's face was inches from mine. Up this close, the performance was completely gone. What was left underneath was something I recognized from 40 years of job sites and boardrooms and difficult rooms of every kind, the expression of a man who is genuinely frightened and has decided that aggression is the fastest way to hide it. "You think this is funny?" he said, his voice cracking on the last word. "You think walking out of there and taking our deal with you is something you just get to do?" "Let go of me, Bradley," I said. He did not let go. Edmund arrived 2 steps behind, breathing in the shallow, effortful way of a man whose body was struggling to keep pace with his anger. His silver hair, perfect all evening, had come slightly loose on one side. His bow tie was crooked. He looked for the first time like what he actually was, a 64-year-old man running out of runway. "Do you have any conception?" he said, stopping close enough that I could see the blood vessels broken across his cheeks from years of expensive scotch. "Of what you have cost this family tonight, that contract was the foundation of the next decade. We had investors in that room who were ready to commit $40 million contingent on that signing. His voice climbed higher with each sentence losing its earlier precision, the careful control unraveling in real time. And you, a broke, pathetic, irrelevant old man in a rented suit, you walked out and took it with you. My son married your daughter, and this is what we get. This is what you bring to this family. I stood against my truck door and let him finish. There was a time in my life when a speech like that would have gotten a response. When I was younger and angrier, and had not yet learned that the most devastating thing you can do to a man who is performing his dominance is to simply watch the performance and say nothing. I was not younger anymore. I looked past Edmund's shoulder. Arabella was standing at the top of the parking garage ramp, where the stairwell door had swung shut behind Edmund and Bradley. She was still in her ivory gown, her arms wrapped around herself against the cold, her face pale under the fluorescent lights. She had followed them down here. She had watched the whole thing. Our eyes met. I held her gaze and waited the same way I had waited in the ballroom, the same way I had waited my entire life for the moment when the person I had raised would show me who she had decided to be when it actually mattered. Her lips pressed together. Her chin dropped slightly. And then she turned and pushed back through the stairwell door and let it close behind her. The sound of the door latching shut echoed off the concrete walls and the low ceiling and every pillar in that garage arriving from every direction at once until it felt like the whole structure was repeating it back to me. I reached up and removed Bradley's hands from my jacket, one at a time, carefully. "Good night, Edmund," I said. I got in my truck, started the engine, pulled out of the space and drove up the ramp toward the street, leaving them standing in the fluorescent light among the Porsches and the Mercedeses, getting smaller in my rearview mirror, until the ramp curved and they disappeared entirely. The night air outside smelled like March in New York, cold and damp, and completely indifferent to everything that had just happened. I drove home without the radio, without the heat, with both hands on the wheel and the specific quality of silence that settles over a man when he has finally understood something he had been refusing to understand for a very long time. The house in Queens looked exactly as it always had. Small, dark, unremarkable in the specific way of houses that have been made deliberately unremarkable by someone who understood that invisibility was a form of protection. The porch light was on because I had left it on the habit of a man who had spent too many years coming home late to a house where no one else was waiting. I sat in the truck in the driveway for a moment, with the engine off, both hands still on the wheel, looking at the front door. The rented tuxedo was ruined. The jacket's collar was stiff and slightly discolored where the ice water had dried into the fabric. My cheekbone still ached faintly where the ice had struck. I was 60 years old, sitting in a cracked leather seat in a vehicle that had cost me $4,000 second-hand 12 years ago, and somewhere across the city, my daughter was dancing at her wedding reception in a $5,000 gown. I got out of the truck and went inside. I did not turn on those overhead lights. I walked through the dark by memory, past the kitchen table, past Arabella's school photographs in their drugstore frames on the hallway shelf, and into the small home office at the end of the corridor. The room smelled like old paper and cedar. It smelled like every important decision I had ever made alone. I moved the bookshelf, pulled back the corner of carpet, crouched down and worked the combination on the floor safe 32 left, 14 right, 58, and pulled the door open. Inside, in the order I had placed them, a sealed plastic bag containing a small black burner phone, and beneath it, a single folded document on heavy cream stock. I took out the document first. The paper was thick and formal, the kind that felt like a promise when you held it. At the top, in clean black type, Apex Holdings LLC Share Transfer Authorization, 20% Equity Interest Beneficiary, Arabella Marie Strathmore, I had prepared it 3 years ago, signed it, sealed it, stored it here in the dark where it would not tempt me to give it before she was ready. Hundreds of millions of dollars on one page. Her inheritance. Her foundation. Everything I had quietly built with the specific intention of one day placing into her hands. I carried it to the kitchen and set it on the table under the single lamp. Sat down. Looked at it for a long time. I thought about the way she had pressed those bills into my palm without meeting my eyes. The way her chin had dropped in the parking garage before she turned away. The 3 times tonight she had been given the chance to be who I raised her to be, and the 3 times she had calculated the cost and chosen differently. She had not been coerced. No one had held anything over her head. She had looked at the situation, weighed me against the life she wanted, and made a decision. Twice in a ballroom, once in a parking garage, cleanly, deliberately, with full knowledge of what she was doing. My hand was steady when I reached for the box of matches on the windowsill. I lit one and touched the flame to the corner of the document. The paper caught immediately, the edge curling dark, the fire moving fast, and certain across everything I had prepared for her. Arabella Marie Strathmore went first. Then 20%. Then the signature I had pressed into the paper with the careful, patient hope of a father who had believed his daughter would eventually find her way to the person she was capable of being. I watched it burn down to ash in the kitchen sink, turned on the tap, watched the ash disappear. Then I reached into the safe for the burner phone. It had not been powered on in 5 years. The screen came to life, slowly loading a secure operating system connected to a private network that very few people in the world knew existed. I dialed a number I had never written down anywhere because there were numbers you kept only in your head. One ring. Strathmore. Jonathan Reed's voice was immediate and alert, as though he had been awake and expecting this. In financial circles, Jonathan was described as a man who dismantled corporations before breakfast and filed the paperwork before lunch. He was the only person alive who knew the full truth of what I had built and why I had hidden it. "Jonathan," I said. My voice had changed somewhere between the parking garage and this kitchen. It was harder now, cleaner. "It's time." A beat. "Then are you certain once we move the camouflage is gone permanently?" I looked at the wet ash circling the drain. "The camouflage," I said, "died tonight." Jonathan Reed's office occupied the entire 47th floor, and at 8 in the morning it already felt like a room where something irreversible was about to happen. I arrived still wearing the previous night's shirt, the collar wrinkled, faintly discolored where the ice water had dried into the fabric. I had not slept. Jonathan took one look at me from across the long mahogany table, pressed his lips together, and said nothing about my appearance. In 20 years of working together, he had learned which observations served a purpose and which ones did not. "Ray is already here," he said, and gestured to the far end of the table. Ray Kowalski was 45 years old, broad-shouldered, with the kind of face that had processed enough of the world's ugliness to stop being surprised by any of it. He had spent a decade with the NYPD Financial Crimes Unit before going private, and he was the best investigator I had ever hired, precise, unsentimental, and constitutionally incapable of softening a finding to protect someone's feelings. He stood when I entered and extended his hand. "Mr. Strathmore," he said, "I think some part of you already knew something was wrong." He was right. I had hired Ray 18 months before the engagement, after the 3rd time Arabella had deflected a question about Bradley's finances, with a brightness that felt rehearsed. I had told myself I was being paranoid. I had told myself a father's instinct was not the same as evidence. Ray opened the first folder and slid it across the table toward me. What was inside hit me the way bad news always hits when you have been half expecting it, not as a shock, but as a confirmation, the worst kind. Beaumont Global Logistics was dying. Slowly, methodically, and with extraordinary care taken to hide the fact from its investors and board. 3 major international contracts lost in 8 months. Operating losses exceeding $14 million in the last 2 quarters alone. And the gap, the enormous widening gap between what the company owed and what it could actually pay, was being filled by money from the Beaumont Charitable Foundation. He has been stealing from elderly donors for 14 months. Ray said, his voice carrying the flat informational quality of a man reading a weather report. People in 4 states who gave because they believed in the mission. Edmund has been routing those contributions directly into Beaumont Global's operating accounts. The FBI's Financial Crimes Division opened a preliminary inquiry 7 months ago. He looked at me steadily. They have been building a case. They were going to move eventually, regardless of what we do. We simply have the opportunity to accelerate the timeline. Sandra Voss, Jonathan's senior legal assistant, a precise and quietly formidable woman who had been arranging documents at the side credenza since I arrived, set a second folder on the table without being asked. I had always respected Sandra's instinct for when a document needed to arrive. Bradley, I said. Ray turned to the next section. Bradley Beaumont owes $20 million to a private lending organization operating out of Red Hook, Brooklyn. He let the number land before continuing. They are not the kind of organization that sends reminder notices. They have 3 open assault investigations with the NYPD and 2 federal racketeering inquiries pending. Bradley has been making partial payments for 8 months. He is 4 months behind. My jaw tightened. $20 million, borrowed from men who collected in ways that left marks. There is one more element, Ray said. His voice shifted, not softer but more deliberate, the way a surgeon's movements become more deliberate as he approaches something critical. The marriage itself. He opened the final section of the folder and turned it to face me. Arabella was not chosen because Bradley loved her, he said. She was chosen because she was unknown. The daughter of a man nobody had ever heard of, with no connections, no financial profile, no one who would look twice at paperwork she signed. He tapped a page near the bottom. In the 3 months before the wedding, Bradley had Arabella sign 14 documents, designating her as the legal representative of the Beaumont Charitable Foundation. She was told they were standard administrative forms for the annual gala sponsorship. He met my eyes directly. She signed them in good faith, Mr. Strathmore. She had no idea what those documents actually represented. The room felt very still. When the FBI moves on the foundation, Jonathan said quietly, every one of those documents points to Arabella as the party with legal authority. She becomes the person who authorized everything. She is the designated fall. He folded his hands. She did not know, but that will not protect her once the indictment comes. My daughter had been constructed into a trap and walked into it smiling in an ivory gown on what she believed was the best day of her life. She doesn't know, I said. My voice came out rougher than I intended, scraped from somewhere lower than my throat. No, Ray said. She has no idea. Jonathan cleared his throat carefully. There is one more file, Silas. He nodded to Sandra, who placed a single printed page in front of me. A banking alert, a trust account. Numbers I recognized immediately, because I had set that account up myself in a hospital corridor while Mary was sleeping. This came through this morning, Jonathan said. Before I tell you what Ray found inside the Beaumont family, and I promise you, nothing could have prepared me for it. Drop the number 7 in the comments right now, so I know you are still here with me. What you are about to hear changed everything, and a gentle heads up, the next part of this story contains some fictionalized details woven in for storytelling purposes. If that is not something you want, this is a good place to step away, no judgment at all. I picked up the banking alert and read it. Then I read it again, because the first time my brain processed the words without fully accepting what they meant. Mary Strathmore. Revocable living, trust full withdrawal, authorization, $5 million, trustee approval, signature. Silas Strathmore. Date March 12, 2025. 3 days before the wedding. I had not signed anything on March 12th. I had not signed anything connected to that trust in 4 years, because the trust document was explicit. The funds were available to Arabella upon marriage, but required my written approval as trustee before any disbursement could be processed. That was the mechanism Mary had insisted on. Not because she did not trust our daughter, because she understood that love without structure was not protection, it was exposure. My signature was on the bottom of the page. I recognized it immediately, the way you recognize something that belongs to you when it appears somewhere it should not be. The specific slant of the S. The firm, unhurried press of the pen on the T. The small, almost invisible loop at the end of the final letter that I had developed over 40 years of signing contracts and had never once thought to consider a vulnerability. Arabella had watched me sign things her entire life. Report cards, permission slips, birthday cards left on the kitchen counter, checks for school fees, for tutoring, for the dress she had wanted for prom that had cost more than I told her it cost, because I did not want her to feel the difference. She had seen my signature hundreds of times. She knew every detail of it. She had used that knowledge to take $5 million from her mother's trust. When? I asked. My voice came out so quiet it barely carried across the table. Jonathan set down his pen. The alert arrived this morning rather than on the 12th because the funds were transferred to a Cayman intermediary account before hitting the final destination. International wire transfers routed through certain offshore structures trigger a 7 to 10 day compliance review before the originating bank's automated systems flag the trustee. He looked at me carefully. The money moved on March 12th. The compliance review completed this morning. By the time the system notified you, the wedding had already taken place and the funds had been sitting in Bradley's account for 4 days. 4 days. The money had been gone for 4 days before I knew to look for it. Jonathan said nothing. He watched my face with the careful attention of a man who has delivered bad news often enough to know when to let it land without commentary. I stood up. I walked to the window, the same window I had stood at 100 times in this office, looking out at the same skyline, making decisions that had shaped the lives of people who had no idea I existed. 47 floors below Manhattan moved through its morning with complete indifference. Taxis, steam, 10,000 people going somewhere specific, none of them carrying what I was carrying right now. Mary had set up that trust the year before she died. She had been sick for 8 months by then, thin and careful in her movements, choosing her words with the deliberate economy of someone who understood that energy was now a finite resource. She had called Jonathan from her hospital bed and dictated the terms herself, her voice steady even when her hands were not. $5 million. Everything we had managed to accumulate before Apex Holdings became what it became. She had wanted Arabella to have something that was purely hers, separate from me, separate from the business, a foundation that belonged entirely to her daughter and carried only her mother's name. She had trusted me to protect it until the right moment. The right moment had apparently been 3 days before Arabella's wedding to a man who owed $20 million to people who broke things for a living. Where did the money go? I asked. My forehead was nearly touching the glass. The cold felt like something I needed. Ray crossed the room. I heard him stop a few feet behind me. He placed a photograph on the windowsill beside my hand, without a word. A house, large and new, set back from the road behind wrought iron gates, surrounded by oak trees just beginning to show their first spring leaves. The kind of property that announced itself quietly, the way serious money did when it had nothing left to prove. Alpine, New Jersey, Ray said. The deed was recorded 11 days ago. Purchase price $4,900,000. He placed a second photograph beside the first. A man and a woman on the front steps, a small boy between them, all three of them laughing at something outside the frame. The woman's name is Christine Halley, 29 years old. The child is Marcus. He is 3 years old. Ray's voice did not change. Bradley acknowledged paternity in New Jersey family court 6 months before the wedding. The filing is sealed but not difficult to access if you know where to look. I stared at the photographs on the windowsill. Mary's money. The last gift my wife had arranged from a hospital bed with trembling hands meant to give our daughter a foundation was sitting inside a house in New Jersey where Bradley Beaumont's other family was waking up this morning. His son, 3 years old, existing in complete secrecy while Arabella planned a wedding and believed she was building a life. Something moved through my chest then that was not anger and not grief, but was built from both of them, cold and dense and absolutely without mercy. Jonathan. I turned from the window. My voice had dropped to a register I rarely used, the one that meant everything subsequent was going to be different from everything prior. Open the execution file. Jonathan looked at me for exactly 1 second. Then he stood, walked to the filing cabinet in the corner, and opened it. Where do you want to start? He said. The building, I said. Then the debt. Then everything else. The execution file had been assembled over 3 years, with the kind of patience that most people mistake for passivity. Jonathan spread the first section across the conference table, a series of documents organized with the surgical precision he brought to everything that mattered. Corporate registrations, licensing certificates, wire transfer protocols, the infrastructure of a plan that had existed in theory for a long time and was now for the first time going to be used. Bradley's debt first, Jonathan said, settling into his chair with his reading glasses in place and his gold pen uncapped. $20 million owed to a private lending organization operating out of Red Hook. Here is how we acquire it legally, completely, and without leaving your name anywhere a search would find it. He walked me through the mechanism the way he walked me through everything, without condescension, without unnecessary detail, with exactly the amount of explanation the situation required. Under the Fair Debt Collection Practices Act, any debt instrument, regardless of the circumstances of its original creation, can be purchased by a licensed third-party entity. Jonathan maintained a Delaware-registered debt acquisition company for precisely this kind of situation. Fully licensed, fully compliant with federal regulations, entirely untraceable back to me, without a court order, and 3 layers of corporate discovery that would take the better part of a year to unwind. We offer them a 10% premium over face value, Jonathan continued. $22 million cash wire transfer immediate settlement. He looked at me over the top of his reading glasses. For an organization that operates outside the legal system and cannot use courts to enforce collection liquid cash without litigation is always the preferred outcome. They will accept. And when they accept, I said, Bradley owes us. Bradley owes Apex Holdings' Delaware subsidiary, Jonathan corrected with the precision of a man for whom that distinction represented the difference between a weapon and a liability. Your name appears nowhere in the chain, but you hold every dollar of his obligation and you can call it due whenever you choose. I picked up the pen and signed the authorization. Sandra had the wire transfer prepared before the signature was dry. She moved to the credenza, made 2 calls in the low, unhurried voice she used for everything, and returned 11 minutes later with a confirmation sheet that she placed in front of Jonathan without a word. Jonathan read it, nodded once, slid it across to me. Transaction confirmed. Debt instrument transferred in full to Apex Holdings Delaware, LLC. I set the paper down and thought about Bradley Beaumont at that exact moment, wherever he was, whatever he was doing, the particular quality of relief he had probably been feeling since the Red Hook organization went quiet after Arabella's wire transfer. The temporary borrowed sense of safety that comes when a dangerous problem appears to have been solved. He had no idea the problem had simply changed hands. He had no idea that the man he had humiliated at his wedding reception, the man his father had thrown ice water on in front of 600 people, the man his wife had thrown money at and asked to disappear, that man now owned every dollar of the debt that was slowly compressing Bradley's life from every direction. "Good," I said. "He doesn't find out until I decide." Jonathan made a note. "Agreed. Now the building." He exchanged the first folder for a second, thicker one. Inside was the original purchase documentation for a 40-story glass and steel tower at a Midtown Manhattan address. I knew by heart because Apex Holdings had acquired it through a subsidiary 8 years ago, and because Edmund Beaumont had been writing quarterly rent checks against it ever since, those checks clearing through 3 intermediary accounts before landing in Apex's operating fund. Edmund had been paying me for 8 years. He had signed his name to those checks. He had initialed the lease renewal notices. He had sat in meetings with his board and described the building's location as a cornerstone of his company's identity and stability, and every dollar of every one of those payments had traveled invisibly and completely into accounts that belonged to the man he had just publicly accused of theft at his son's wedding. "His current lease expires June 30th, Jonathan said. "He is presently negotiating a 10-year renewal. He has told his board the renewal is essentially guaranteed, and he is using it as the centerpiece of a private equity pitch, $40 million, contingent on demonstrated operational stability." He tapped the folder. "The renewal is the linchpin. Without it, the bailout collapses. Without the bailout, Beaumont Global is insolvent inside 90 days. The notice of lease non-renewal was a single page, 4 lines of standard legal language and a signature block. "He will spend the next 3 weeks negotiating in good faith," I said, "believing the future is still open." "Yes," Jonathan said. "Good." I signed the page. Let him believe it. Sandra collected the document without being asked and began preparing the formal filing. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, Manhattan glittered in the March morning light, indifferent, enormous, entirely unaware that 2 pieces of paper had just been signed that would change the shape of one family's world completely and permanently. The trap was not yet closed, but every wall had been built. Every exit had been measured and sealed. What remained now was only the door and the moment I chose to lock it. The next phase took 6 days and required the kind of patience that feels like its own form of violence. Jonathan established 3 separate acquisition entities over the course of 72 hours. A Delaware holding company registered under a name that meant nothing to anyone without the specific knowledge to connect it to Apex Holdings. A London proxy structured through a British solicitor Jonathan had worked with for a decade and trusted completely. And a Cayman Islands private equity shell, the kind of entity that existed in the financial world as a form of legal silence present in every required record and invisible in every practical narrative. Through these 3 entities, working in careful sequence timed to avoid triggering automatic regulatory review, Jonathan purchased every outstanding debt instrument connected to Beaumont Global Logistics, every commercial loan, every extended credit line, every deferred payment obligation Edmund had accumulated over 14 months of pretending his company was not quietly drowning. The total figure when Jonathan laid the final confirmation sheet in front of me on the sixth day was $31 million. $31 million. That was the full weight of Edmund Beaumont's performance borrowed against a company worth perhaps $8 million in recoverable assets, sustained entirely by investor confidence in a man who had not deserved that confidence for over a year. When the required SEC disclosures are filed, Jonathan said, Edmund will know the debt has changed hands, but by that point every creditor he might have appealed to will already be us, and there will be nothing left to appeal to. He folded his hands on the table. He has no exit. He simply does not know it yet. I looked at the confirmation sheet for a moment. $31 million in debt now owned by shell companies that traced back to me through 3 layers of entirely legitimate corporate structure. Edmund had built his empire on borrowed money and borrowed time, and both had now run out. He just had not been informed. He still thinks the lease renewal is coming, I said. He does, Jonathan confirmed. His property management team sent us a revised proposal 2 days ago. They are offering slightly improved terms, believing it will help close the deal. He allowed himself a small, dry pause. I have not responded. Sandra set a fresh envelope on the table, without being asked her instinct for the right document, at the right moment, so reliable it had long since stopped registering as remarkable. The envelope was made of heavy cream paper, a wax seal on the back pressed with a crest I recognized from the wedding invitations Arabella had shown me 8 months ago when she was still excited about everything the Beaumont name represented. I opened it. Inside was a formal gala invitation, gold ink on heavy cardstock, Edmund Beaumont's name at the top, the words, "An evening celebrating the dawn of a new era," printed beneath it, with the confident flourish of a man who had no idea his era had already ended, and taped to the back a smaller card. Arabella's handwriting, the looping, careful cursive I had taught her at a kitchen table in Queens when she was 7 years old. Dad, I know you're probably still upset about the wedding, but Bradley and I want you to come and see what real success looks like. The Beaumonts are closing a deal this weekend that will secure our family for generations. This is the world I belong in now. You should see it. Come if you want. But please dress like you belong there this time. I read it twice. The condescension was extraordinary, but that was not what made my throat tighten until I had to set the card down and look away for a moment. What made my throat tighten was the phrase, our family. She had written our family and meant the Beaumonts, the family that had publicly humiliated her father 3 weeks ago, the family that had engineered her destruction so carefully she had walked into it beaming, the family whose son had a 3-year-old child with another woman in a house purchased with the money Arabella had stolen from her dead mother's trust. Our family. I set the invitation on the table and pressed it flat with my palm. Then I looked at Jonathan, who was watching me with the careful, neutral expression of a man who understood that some moments required presence rather than commentary. Get me the name of the best tailor in Midtown, I said. I need a suit by Friday. Jonathan studied my face for exactly 1 second. Then something shifted at the corner of his mouth, not quite a smile, but the suggestion of one arriving and departing so quickly it might have been imagined. I know someone, he said, and reached for his phone. The tailor's shop had no sign outside, except a small brass plate engraved with a single name, Caruso, set into the stone beside a door on West 54th Street that looked like it belonged to an apartment building and opened instead into something else entirely. Dark wood paneling, bolts of imported wool arranged along brass racks by weight and color, the smell of cedar and sizing, and the particular serious quiet of a room where people came to be measured for things that mattered. Caruso himself was 70 years old, small and precise with the unhurried movements of a man who had spent half a century making things fit correctly and had long since stopped being impressed by anything except the work itself. He circled me with a measuring tape for several minutes without speaking. Then he stepped back and looked at me in the 3-panel mirror, with his head tilted slightly to one side. "You have the build of a man who has worked with his hands his whole life," he said. His accent was Northern Italian, clipped and musical. "I have," I said. He nodded as though this confirmed something he had already suspected. "Then we do midnight blue. Not black is for funerals and apologies. Midnight blue is for men who walk into rooms and change them." He smoothed a fabric sample across my shoulder with the flat of his palm. "Ready by Friday evening." I looked at myself in the mirror. The man looking back was 60 years old, broad across the shoulders, with hands still rough at the knuckles from decades of work done long before the money arrived. For 15 years, I had looked at that man in bathroom mirrors and kitchen windows and the dark glass of office buildings at night, and I had told him to stay small, to stay invisible, to remember that the performance was the protection. I was done performing. The suit was ready Thursday. I drove it home in the garment bag and hung it on the outside of the closet door. Then I went to the backyard. I carried everything out in 3 trips. Every flannel shirt, every pair of worn jeans, every canvas jacket with its torn pockets and faded elbows. The boots I had worn to 100 job sites. The baseball caps. The cheap waterproof jacket I had bought at a hardware store 12 years ago, and worn so often the color had gone from green to a vague institutional gray. I stacked it all in the metal fire pit I used for burning leaves in October, soaked it with lighter fluid from the garage, and dropped a match into the center. The flames caught with a sound like an exhaled breath, a soft, immediate whoosh, and climbed fast through 15 years of carefully constructed ordinariness. May Holloway appeared at her back fence within 2 minutes, drawn by the smoke, the way she was always drawn by anything that suggested I might need someone nearby without being willing to say so. She looked at the fire, looked at me. Then she leaned her forearms on the top rail of the fence and said nothing for a long moment, which was one of the things I valued most about May. Her understanding that silence could be a form of company rather than an absence of it. "The whole wardrobe," she said finally. "Everything that was a lie," I said. She pressed her lips together. The fire crackled between us. "You're going Saturday." "I am." May looked at me for a long time with the eyes she used when she was deciding how much to say. "Be careful, Silas," she said at last. "Not with them. With yourself." She pushed off the fence and went back inside without waiting for an answer, which meant she understood that the answer I would give her and the answer that was true were not necessarily the same thing. That night alone in my home office, I opened the bottom drawer of my desk and took out the envelope I had not touched in 5 years. Mary's letter. Written in the last weeks in the hospital in handwriting that had gotten smaller and more careful as her strength diminished, as though she was conserving the energy required to form each letter, making sure every word earned its place on the page. I sat down and read it all the way through slowly, for the first time since the year she died. When I finished, I folded it along its original creases and held it for a moment. Then I stood crossed to the closet and placed it in the inside pocket of the midnight blue suit. I would carry it tomorrow. Whatever happened in that room, I would carry her with me. My phone rang. "Jonathan, the federal warrant was signed 2 hours ago," he said without preamble. "The Financial Crimes Division has confirmed their team will be in position by 9 o'clock Saturday evening. Everything is ready." I looked at the suet hanging in the darkness of my bedroom doorway, the fabric catching a faint edge of light from the hallway, dark and precise, and nothing like anything I had worn in 15 years. "So am I," I said. "Before I walk through those doors, before I show you what happened when Edmund Beaumont finally saw my face in that room drop, Table 12 in the comments. Let me know you have been with me from the beginning, because what happens next, I spent 15 years waiting for. Note the scene ahead includes some dramatized elements added to honor the weight of this moment. If dramatic storytelling is not for you, feel free to choose something else, but I hope you stay. The Plaza Hotel on a Saturday night in April looked exactly the way money looks when it has decided to celebrate itself. Limousines 3 deep along the curb. Photographers behind velvet ropes calling out names. Women in silk gowns moving through the entrance with the unhurried certainty of people who had never once questioned whether they belonged somewhere. The floodlights turned the whole facade into something that looked less like a building and more like a statement. I pulled my 2004 pickup truck into the left lane and drove straight to the front. The valet was young, 22, maybe 23, in a crisp red jacket that fit him perfectly, which was more than I could come for the rented tuxedo I had worn 3 weeks ago to a wedding that had ended with ice water on my face and $2,000 on a tablecloth. He stepped forward, with both hands raised, in the universal gesture of someone trying to prevent a disaster they could not yet fully name. "Sir, this entrance is reserved for—" I stepped out of the truck. The midnight blue suit caught the floodlights the way Caruso had said it would, quietly without announcing itself, with the authority of something made correctly for a specific purpose. I reached back into the cab, considered removing the garment bag, decided against it. The truck would stay exactly as it was. Let it sit among the Bentleys and the Aston Martins, like a question the evening had not prepared itself to answer. I folded a $100 bill around the keys and pressed them into the valet's hand. "Keep it out front," I said. "I won't be long." He looked at the bill, looked at the truck, looked at the suit. His mouth opened and closed once without any sound emerging from it, which I found entirely reasonable given the circumstances. I turned and walked up the carpet. The head of security was a large man in his late 40s, who carried himself with the particular posture of someone who had once been military and had never fully left it behind, shoulders back, weight distributed evenly, moving in the practiced pattern of a man who assessed everything that entered his field of vision and categorized it in under 3 seconds. He stepped forward as I reached the entrance. "Good evening, sir. Name for the guest registry." "Strathmore," I said. "Silas Strathmore." He scrolled his tablet, scrolled again. The slight tightening around his eyes told me the answer before he spoke it. "I apologize, Mr. Strathmore. Your name doesn't appear on the executive guest list. This is a private corporate event I'll need to ask you to—" I reached into the inside pocket of my jacket. Both security guards flanking the entrance straightened. The chief's hand moved fractionally toward his radio. I drew out a single folded document slowly, deliberately, with the unhurried confidence of a man who understood that what he was holding was more persuasive than anything else he could have produced, and held it out across the velvet rope. He took it, unfolded it, began reading. I watched his face as the information arrived. The address at the top of the page, 1180 Avenue of the Americas, the 40-story tower where Edmund Beaumont had been running his empire for 8 years, registered first. Then the name of the owning entity. Then, at the bottom of the page in the signature block that carried the full legal weight of what the document represented, the name of the sole authorized executive and owner. The color left his face completely, not gradually, not in stages. It left the way conviction leaves a man who has just understood that the ground beneath him is not what he believed it to be all at once, and with no obvious path back. "Sir," he said, and his voice had dropped an entire register without his appearing to notice. We had absolutely no idea. I sincerely apologize for—" "The rope," I said. He turned so quickly he nearly lost his balance. "Drop the rope," he told his team, his voice cracking slightly on the last word. "Open both doors, right now." The velvet barrier came down. The double glass doors swung open. I walked through without breaking stride, without acknowledging the apology still forming on his lips, without looking back at the truck sitting among the imported sports cars under the bright lights of the plaza entrance. Inside the atrium blazed chandeliers, champagne. 600 of New York's most powerful people arranged in the comfortable formations of those who believed the world had been organized for their convenience. An orchestra played something Viennese in the far corner. Corporate banners displayed the Beaumont Global logo in confident gold lettering across every available surface, the flag of an empire that did not yet know it had fallen. And at the far end of the room, elevated on a stage, beneath a spotlight that had been positioned to make him look inevitable, Edmund Beaumont stood at a crystal podium with a champagne flute raised above his head, his silver hair immaculate, his voice carrying the warm authority of a man at the peak of everything he had constructed. He had spent 3 weeks constructing a new narrative around the collapsed signing, blaming it on undisclosed conflicts in Mercer's portfolio, reframing it publicly as a strategic withdrawal rather than a rejection. His investors had accepted the explanation because they wanted to. That was the thing about men like Edmund. They understood that confidence maintained long enough and loudly enough could substitute for the truth in most rooms most of the time. He believed tonight was proof of that. He had not seen me yet. I straightened my cuffs. I felt the slight weight of Mary's letter in my inside pocket, and began walking toward the stage with the unhurried certainty of a man crossing a room he owned. Because I did. Edmund saw me when I was 40 feet from the stage. I watched it happen with the precision of a man who had been waiting for this specific moment for 3 weeks and intended to observe every detail of it. His eyes found me in the crowd, the way a compass needle finds north, not searching, but arriving, snapping into place with the involuntary certainty of recognition. And then his face did something I had never seen Edmund Beaumont's face do in the 3 years I had known of his existence. It faltered, not collapsed, not shattered. Simply faltered a single missed beat in the rhythm of a performance that had been running without interruption for his entire adult life. His mouth continued moving for 2 more sentences before the rest of him caught up, and by then the guests nearest the stage had begun to notice that the man at the podium was no longer entirely present in his own speech. I did not slow down. I climbed the stage steps without hesitation, without requesting permission, without acknowledging the murmur that moved through the crowd as I passed. The people nearest me stepped aside with the instinctive deference given to those who move as though they know exactly where they are going and why, which I did. Edmund's composure fractured as I reached the top of the steps. His hand shot out toward the side of the stage. "Security! This man is a trespasser. Remove him immediately." The head of security took 2 deliberate steps forward from his position at the stage's edge. He looked at Edmund. He looked at me. Then he clasped his hands in front of him, planted his feet, and did not move another inch. "I'm not able to do that, Mr. Beaumont," he said, in the careful, neutral tone of a man who had made a decision and was committed to it. Edmund's face flushed so dark the color looked painful. He turned to me with his chest heaving and both hands gripping the podium so hard his knuckles had gone white. "Who do you think you are?" he demanded, his voice cracking on the last word in a way I suspected he had not intended. "You have no right to be on this stage. You have no right to be in this building. You are nothing. Strathmore, you are a broke, irrelevant old man who doesn't know when he's not wanted, and I am going to have you dragged out of here by your collar the same way I should have done 3 weeks ago." I reached out and took the microphone from his hand. I did it the way you take something that belongs to you when it has been held by someone else for too long, without drama, without aggression, with the simple and complete certainty of ownership. Edmund's fingers released it before his mind had finished instructing them to hold on. The shock of the gesture, its calmness, its totality seemed to empty him of the next several sentences he had prepared. I turned to face the room. 600 faces looked back at me. The room had gone very still, the particular stillness that settles over a crowd of intelligent people when they understand that something real is happening, and that the thing they came to see is no longer the thing they are watching. "Good evening," I said. My voice carried cleanly through the sound system, calm and unhurried, the voice of a man with nothing to hide and no reason to hurry. "My name is Silas Strathmore." I let the name settle. 3 weeks ago, at the Grand Harrington Hotel, I sat at table 12 beside the kitchen door, while this man poured ice water on my face, placed his watch in my pocket, and had me accused of theft in front of 600 people. A pause. "Tonight I want to show you what kind of man you have been trusting with your money." Behind me, the 30-foot LED screen came to life. Sandra Voss, positioned in the technical booth on the mezzanine, moved through the presentation with the precise, unhurried efficiency that characterized everything she did. Financial statements appeared on the screen, Beaumont Global's actual balance sheets, the figures Edmund had been shielding from his investors for 14 months. Red numbers. Catastrophic red numbers in columns that told a story no amount of confident speech-making could contradict. Then, the Beaumont Charitable Foundation records donation receipts, internal transfer documents, the path that elderly donors' money had traveled from their accounts into Edmund's operating fund, rendered in clean, court-ready digital form. The sound that moved through the room was not quite a gasp. It was quieter and more dangerous than a gasp. The sound of 600 people simultaneously revising their understanding of the ground they were standing on. "The lease renewal Mr. Beaumont promised you," I continued, "was denied. As of yesterday, Beaumont Global has 30 days to vacate its corporate headquarters." I let that land before continuing. "The building at 1180 Avenue of the Americas has been owned by Apex Holdings for 8 years. I founded Apex Holdings. Edmund has been writing rent checks into my accounts since 2017 without ever knowing my name." Edmund lunged forward. "That is a lie. You cannot stand here and—" 2 members of my security team stepped between us smoothly. Edmund bounced off them and stumbled back against the podium, grabbing it with both hands, his face contorted with a fury that had nowhere left to go. "But the building," I said to the room, my voice unchanged, "is not the most important thing I want to show you tonight." I reached into my jacket pocket and withdrew the burner phone. "Let me tell you about the young woman this family married specifically so she could go to prison in their place. And then let me play you something her husband said in his own words about why he chose her." Across the atrium near the back wall, I found Arabella's face in the crowd, without looking for it. She had gone completely still. Her champagne flute had lowered to her side, forgotten. On the screen behind me, her name was appearing in document after document. Her signature, her designation as legal representative, the architecture of the trap she had been walking toward since the day Bradley Beaumont had decided she was exactly what he needed. Her lips were parted. Her eyes were moving between the screen and my face with the rapid, desperate attention of someone trying to find a version of what they were seeing that made a different kind of sense. I looked at my daughter across that room and felt something tear quietly in the center of my chest, not breaking, just tearing the way old fabric tears when it has been held together past the point it was meant to hold. Then I pressed play. Bradley's voice filled the Plaza Hotel like something that could not be recalled. The sound system carried it to every corner of the atrium, clear, unhurried. carrying the particular confidence of a man who had believed he was speaking privately to someone he had already dismissed as irrelevant. 600 people heard it simultaneously, and the effect was the same across the room, a collective stillness, the kind that arrives when something true has entered a space and everyone present understands at the same moment that nothing in that space will be the same after it leaves. She's not my wife in any real sense. She's my signature. When the feds come knocking, she's the one with her name on the paperwork. I needed someone clean, nobody's daughter from nowhere, and she walked right into it. A silence so complete, it had texture. Then his voice again, easy and unhurried, the voice of a man relaxed in his own certainty. She actually believes I love her. It's almost touching how much she believes it. I was watching Arabella when those words reached her. She did not cry out. She did not step backward or reach for something to hold on to. What happened to her was quieter and more total than any of those things, a full-body stillness that arrived so suddenly it looked like something had been switched off. Her champagne flute slipped from her fingers and shattered on the marble floor, and she did not look down at it, did not flinch at the sound, because the sound inside her was so much larger than anything happening in that room. She turned and looked at Bradley. He was already moving. He had been calculating since the moment I reached into my jacket pocket. I understood that now watching him, seeing the way his eyes had been measuring exits and distances, with the practiced efficiency of a man who had spent years staying one step ahead of what he owed. He did not look at Arabella with guilt. He did not look at her with sorrow or remorse or even the basic human acknowledgement that she deserved an explanation. He looked at her the way you look at a door you need to get through. He grabbed her by both arms and shoved her sideways hard with his full weight behind it, the explosive force of pure panic wearing the costume of aggression. Arabella went down onto the marble floor with a sound that cut through the atrium like a physical thing. Her palms hit first, then her knees. The ivory gown, the same gown she had worn to what she believed was the best day of her life, tore along the side seam with a sound that seemed to echo. A cry broke from her, sharp and involuntary and completely unguarded, the sound of someone who had been trying so hard to hold herself together that she had no reserves left for anything else. Bradley did not look back. He made it 4 steps toward the service corridor before Jonathan's voice came from the side of the stage level and carrying and entirely without drama. Now! The 2 FBI agents who had been positioned near the service corridor since 9 o'clock moved into the atrium with the efficiency of people who had done this in many rooms and found it unremarkable. Their credentials were already visible. They reached Bradley before he reached the door, and the handcuffs went on with a small, clean, metallic click that traveled across the sudden silence of the room with extraordinary clarity. From the stage, I watched Edmund watch his son get arrested. Something left Edmund's face in that moment, not just the confidence, not just the performance, but something more essential than either of those things. The specific quality of a man who has always believed at the deepest level of himself that consequences were for other people. That belief left him now completely and permanently, and what remained in its place was something small and frightened and entirely ordinary. Mr. Beaumont. A federal agent had reached the base of the stage steps. His voice was professionally flat. I have a warrant for your arrest on federal charges including wire fraud, charitable fund misappropriation, and securities fraud. Please step down from the stage. Edmund looked at me. I held his gaze. I did not speak. I did not smile. I simply looked at him the way you look at something that has finally become what it always was. His shoulders dropped. The last resistance left him so completely and so suddenly that he seemed to diminish inside his bespoke tuxedo, as though the suit had been built for a larger man than the one currently occupying it. He gripped the podium one final time, not with fury, but with the reflexive steadiness of someone whose legs could no longer be entirely trusted. And then he let go and walked down the steps. The handcuffs went on in front of 600 witnesses. I stepped down from the stage. The crowd was fracturing around me, phones out, voices urgent, the elegant formations of the evening dissolving into something much less composed. I moved through it without stopping, heading toward the place on the marble floor, where my daughter was still on her hands and knees, her shoulders shaking with sobs. She was no longer trying to contain her hair fallen across her face. The torn ivory gown spread around her on the cold marble like the wreckage of something that had once been beautiful. I stopped 10 feet away. She looked up and found my face. Her eyes were streaming, her mascara tracking in dark lines down both cheeks, her bottom lip trembling so hard she was pressing her teeth against it to make it stop. She raised one hand toward me, not demanding, not grasping, just reaching. The way a child reaches in the dark when they are frightened and have run out of words. "Dad." The word broke cleanly in half on its way out of her mouth. I looked at my daughter on the floor of the Plaza Hotel, in the ruins of everything she had chosen, and felt the specific agony of a father who loves someone he cannot save from the consequences of who they decided to be. Then I turned and walked toward the exit. The Sunday papers carried it on the front page. I sat at the kitchen table in Queens with black coffee and 3 different newspapers spread across the worn wood, reading the same story told in 3 different registers. The financial press was precise: federal charges, asset freeze, stock collapse. The business tabloids were louder: Empire falls, Beaumont Global CEO arrested at own gala. The general press had found the human angle, the charitable foundation, the elderly donors, the money that had traveled from their accounts into Edmund's operating fund, while he stood at podiums accepting awards for his generosity. I read all 3 and set them aside. Jonathan messaged at 7. Brief efficient. Stock suspended. Building secured by Apex Holdings midnight. Federal prosecutor confirmed cooperation discussions with a party connected to the case. Bradley Beaumont's whereabouts currently unknown. That last line I read twice. Bradley had run. Of course he had. The man who had pushed his wife onto a marble floor and walked away without looking back was not built for staying to face the accounting. He had a sports car in the valet lot, and no loyalty to anything that couldn't be immediately liquidated, and a 3-year-old son in Alpine who didn't yet know his father was a fugitive. I thought about Arabella, not with anger that had finished itself somewhere on the drive home last night. What remained was something quieter and more complicated, the specific grief of a parent who loves someone and cannot protect them from the consequences of who they have chosen to be. She had committed a federal crime for a man currently running across state lines. She would spend the next several months learning in the most detailed and unforgiving way possible exactly what that had cost. I could not undo it. I was not going to try. What I had already done quietly through Jonathan's office without announcement was ensure that when the federal prosecutor's team approached Arabella about a cooperation agreement, they found a lawyer already in place. Not the public defender's card I intended to give her when she came to me. Someone who understood federal fraud cases and could navigate the cooperation process without letting her be consumed by it. She did not know it came from me. She would not be told. Some things you do because they are right, and not because you need to be thanked for them. Jonathan called at 9:30. Bradley's car was found at Newark Airport at 6 this morning. He didn't board a flight. A second vehicle was likely waiting. The federal fugitive warrant was issued an hour ago. A pause. It won't take long. Men like Bradley Beaumont are not built for sustained disappearance. And Edmund, I asked. Arraignment Monday morning. His attorneys are attempting to negotiate. The prosecutor is not interested. I looked out the kitchen window at the backyard where the fire pit still held the ash of 15 flannel shirts and a canvas jacket and a baseball cap that had gone from green to gray over 12 years of being worn to places I was pretending to belong. "Good," I said. After I hung up, I sat at the kitchen table for a long time, in the quiet of a Sunday morning in Queens. Newspapers spread in front of me, coffee cold, and thought about what came next. Not revenge. That was finished. Not grief, exactly. That would take longer. Something else. The specific, unfamiliar feeling of a man who has been carrying something very heavy for a very long time, and has just set it down and is standing in the sudden lightness of his own hands, trying to remember what he used to do with them. I called May and told her the apple cake could wait until Tuesday. She said that was fine. She had known it would be. 6 months is long enough for the world to forget a scandal, and short enough for the people inside it to remember every detail. It was October when Jonathan came up to Hudson Valley, with the final paperwork, driving the 2 miles from the gate to the house in his black sedan with his leather briefcase on the passenger seat, and the particular expression he wore when something important was about to be completed. I was on the terrace with my coffee when I heard the car on the gravel. The oaks around the lake had turned deep amber and rust, and the specific saturated red that only comes in October in the Hudson Valley, the kind of color that makes you understand why people drove 3 hours from the city just to look at trees. He came out onto the terrace and set the briefcase on the table and opened it without preamble. Edmund's sentencing was last Thursday, he said, arranging the documents in the order they needed to be signed. 31 counts. The judge gave him 12 years in a federal correctional facility. He will be 76 years old when he is eligible for release. Jonathan's voice carried the flat, informational quality he used when facts were sufficient on their own, and commentary would only diminish them. His defense team attempted to argue that he was the victim of a targeted corporate takeover. The judge was not persuaded. I thought about Edmund Beaumont standing at a crystal podium 6 months ago, silver hair, immaculate, champagne raised, telling 600 people that his empire was untouchable. I thought about the man who had poured ice water on my face and called me a footnote. I did not feel triumph. I felt something quieter and more durable, the specific satisfaction of a balance that has been restored to its correct position after a long time spent wrong. "Bradley," I asked. "Plea agreement accepted 3 weeks ago. 8 years federal facility in New Jersey. He will serve a minimum of 6 before he is eligible for parole consideration." Jonathan placed a document in front of me. His legal team tried to negotiate down. The federal prosecutor declined. A pause. The recording was significant. It is difficult to argue for leniency when the jury has heard the defendant describe his wife as a designed scapegoat in his own voice. I picked up the pen. "And Arabella," I said. Jonathan was quiet for a moment, the kind of quiet that means the information requires some care in the delivery. Her cooperation agreement held. She provided material testimony against both Edmund and Bradley, and the federal prosecutor honored the arrangement. No prison time. He folded his hands on the table. "The restitution order is substantial. The court attached it to the charitable fraud recovery she is required to make monthly payments for 7 years. Her assets were liquidated almost entirely to cover the initial settlement." He looked at me carefully. "She has been making her payments on time, every month without exception since the order was issued." I thought about that for a moment. About Arabella in a waitress uniform, somewhere in this city, carrying plates, refilling coffee, counting tips at the end of a long shift to make sure the numbers worked for the month's payment. I thought about Mary, who had done the same thing for 3 years, in a diner on Queens Boulevard, while I was getting the first contracts off the ground, who had never once complained and never once stopped believing that the life we were working toward was worth the one we were living in the meantime. The apple had not fallen as far from the tree as I had feared. It had simply taken a very long time and a very hard landing to find its way back to the ground. 2 weeks ago, a letter had arrived at the estate with no return address. Inside a single photograph. Arabella in a yellow waitress uniform taken from across a diner counter, candid unposed, catching her mid-laugh at something a customer had said. Her head was thrown back, her whole face open and unguarded, in a way I had not seen since she was young enough to believe that everything was going to be fine, because I was there to make it so. On the back in her handwriting, 3 words. I understand now. I had not written back. I was not ready for that, and I was done pretending to be ready for things before the time had actually come. But I had not thrown the photograph away. It was in the inside pocket of the midnight blue suit next to Mary's letter, where it had been since the morning it arrived. Jonathan nudged the first document toward me. The trust is ready to execute whenever you are. I looked at the papers. The Strathmore Educational Trust. A fully endowed scholarship fund, full tuition living stipends, and zero-interest business grants for underprivileged students across the United States. 90% of everything I had built over 40 years transferred in a single morning into the hands of people who had never been handed anything and had kept going anyway. The kids who worked double shifts to pay for community college. The single mothers studying under flickering kitchen lights after their children were asleep. The ones who understood the way Mary had understood, the way I had understood, that the only foundation worth building was the one you constructed yourself with your own hands from the ground up. I picked up the pen and signed the first page, then the second, the third. Page after page, my signature moving across the documents with the same steady pressure I had used for 40 years, the small slant of the S, the firm line of the T, the loop at the end, that Arabella had once known well enough to copy. Jonathan gathered the signed documents and returned them to his briefcase with the careful efficiency of a man who understood that some things once done needed to be treated with the respect of completed work. He snapped the brass lock shut and sat back in his chair and looked out at the lake for a moment. "It is an honor, Silas," he said quietly. "Everything you built, the way you chose to end it." I looked out at the water. The October light was coming in low and golden across the surface, turning the lake into something that looked like it had been lit from underneath. The oaks stood around the shoreline in their autumn colors, enormous and unhurried, and entirely indifferent to everything that had happened in the past 7 months. May arrived at 11 with apple pie wrapped in a dish towel and no agenda whatsoever, the way May always arrived. She sat down in her chair and poured herself coffee from the pot I had left on the table and cut 3 slices of the pie, one for me, one for Jonathan, one for herself. And we sat there on the terrace as the morning moved toward noon and the light changed on the water, and nobody said anything that needed to be said. At some point, Jonathan excused himself and drove back down the gravel road, and May and I sat together in the comfortable silence of people who had known each other long enough that silence did not require filling. I was not happy. I was not certain I remembered what happy felt like in the uncomplicated way it had felt before Mary died, before Arabella grew up, before the long, slow divergence between the life I was living and the life I had hoped to live had accumulated into something I could no longer pretend not to notice. But I was free, and I was at peace. And I was sitting on a terrace above a lake in October, with black coffee and apple pie, and a woman who had knocked on my door for 19 years without ever needing a reason. And the morning was very quiet, and the trees were burning red and gold along the water. And somewhere in the city, my daughter was learning slowly, painfully, in the only way that lessons worth keeping are ever actually learned, what love costs when you have spent it carelessly. The photograph was in my pocket. I would write back. Not today, not this month perhaps. But eventually, when the time had earned itself and the words had found their shape, I would write back. For now, the lake was enough. The October light was enough. The pie was excellent and May was here, and after 60 years of building things in silence after ice water and stolen watches and a ballroom floor, and a daughter's hand reaching toward me through the wreckage of everything she had chosen, I had finally completely and without apology stopped making myself small. That was enough. For now, and perhaps for a long time after now, that was everything. The valet brought my truck around without being asked. I pressed a bill into his hand, got in, and pulled out onto Fifth Avenue without looking back at the building I had just walked out of. The city at 11 on a Saturday night was loud and indifferent, which was exactly what I needed. I drove surface streets home, through Midtown, across town, down through the grid, the way I had driven it for 40 years past bodegas and parking garages, and the amber glow of streetlights on wet pavement. My hands were steady on the wheel. That surprised me. I had expected shaking, or the specific release that comes when long tension finally breaks. Instead, there was only a quietness behind my sternum that felt less like peace and more like the absence of something that had occupied that space for a very long time. I thought about Edmund's face when his shoulders dropped. I thought about Bradley going down onto one knee on the marble floor, breathing in ragged bursts while the handcuffs went on. I thought about Arabella's hand reaching up toward me from the floor of the Plaza Hotel, and the words she said, and what it had cost her to say it. That one I set aside. There would be time for it later. My phone buzzed on the passenger seat. May. Saw the news. Are you all right? I typed back at a red light on Queens Boulevard. All right. Home soon. 3 dots. Then apple cake in the morning. Don't argue. I set the phone down and drove the last 4 blocks to the house. I pulled into the cracked driveway and sat with the engine off for a moment, looking at the porch light I had left on that morning, the habit of a man who had spent too many years coming home late to a house where no one was waiting. I went inside, turned off the porch light, and for the first time in 15 years slept without dreaming of anything at all. She came on a Tuesday. 7 days after the plaza, at 8:30 in the morning, the intercom at the front gate buzzed, and my security chief's voice came through with the careful neutrality of a man delivering information that he understood required a decision he was not going to make for me. Miss Strathmore is at the gate, sir. On foot. She's asking to be let in. I was on the terrace with my coffee watching the April mist lift off the surface of the lake in slow, dissolving columns. May Holloway was in the chair beside mine she had driven up from Queens the previous evening without being asked, appearing at the estate entrance with an overnight bag and a covered dish that turned out to be the apple cake she made when she understood that the situation called for presence rather than words. I looked out at the lake for a moment. Open the gate, I said, but don't send a car. May looked at me over the rim of her cup. She did not say anything. She had known me for 19 years, and in 19 years she had developed an accurate instinct for the moments when speaking would cost more than it contributed. It took Arabella 43 minutes to walk the 2 miles from the gate to the house. I watched her on the security monitor for the first half of it, moving up the long gravel drive with her head down and her arms wrapped tightly around herself against the April chill, wearing gray sweatpants and a faded sweater that was doing almost nothing against the cold, her sneakers entirely wrong for gravel. The woman who had floated across the Grand Harrington Ballroom in $5,000 of ivory silk 1 month ago was not present in the figure on that monitor. She had been replaced by someone who moved as though the ground beneath her feet had proven unreliable recently, and she was not yet prepared to trust it. When she finally climbed the stone steps to the terrace, she was breathing in the uneven, labored way of someone whose lungs had been running at capacity for days before she ever started walking. Her eyes were swollen and deeply shadowed, the specific exhaustion of grief that has moved past the acute stage and settled in for a longer stay. Her hands were shaking at her sides with fine, persistent tremors she was making no effort to conceal. She stopped at the edge of the terrace. She looked at the house, at the lake, at the grounds extending in every direction, immaculate and vast, and entirely real, entirely present, entirely the thing it had always been. I watched the understanding arrive on her face the way dawn arrives, not all at once, but incrementally, each new piece of light, revealing something that had been there in the dark all along. Her chin began to tremble so hard she could not control it. She pressed her lips together until they went white at the edges, fighting the sob that was building in her chest, with everything she had left, which was not much. "Dad." Her voice came out wrecked, scraped hollow from the inside, barely carrying across the terrace. The voice of a woman who had rehearsed this moment in 100 different versions and found that none of them had prepared her for what it actually felt like to be here saying this to this man. "I know I have no right to ask you for anything. I know what I did. I know there is no explanation that makes it right." Her voice broke on the last word, and she stopped pressing her fingers hard against her mouth, her whole body shaking with the force of the sob she was trying to hold back. It broke through anyway, a single jagged sound that she had no reserves left to prevent. "I am so sorry. I am so sorry for what I did to you, for what I let them do to you, for Mom's money, for standing there in that parking garage and—" She stopped again. Her knees were shaking visibly now, her whole frame trembling, as though the effort of remaining upright was requiring everything she had. "Please, please just tell me what I have to do." May set her coffee cup down on the table and went inside without a sound. I looked at my daughter for a long time. I thought about the 7-year-old girl who had squeezed my hand at Mary's funeral in the rain. Her small fingers curled tight around mine, trying to be brave for me when I was supposed to be the one being brave for her. I thought about the teenager who had left handwritten notes on the kitchen counter when she came home late, not because I required it, but because she understood that a father alone in a house worries, and she did not want me to worry. I thought about the woman who had stood in a ballroom 3 weeks ago and pressed $2,000 into my palm and asked me to disappear from her life, and the look on her face in that moment. Not cruelty, not indifference. Terror. The specific terror of someone so desperate to hold on to something they have decided they cannot live without, that they are willing to destroy the thing they cannot actually survive losing. She had not known that yet. She knew it now. I reached into the inside pocket of my jacket. Mary's letter. I had carried it to the plaza and carried it home again, and had not taken it out since, but I took it out now and unfolded it along its original creases, the paper soft at the folds from years of being opened and closed, the handwriting smaller and more careful near the end of the page where Mary's strength had been running out, and she had been making every word count. I read the passage aloud. My voice was steady. It had been a long time since this cost me anything to say. "If the day comes when she chooses money over love, don't rescue her from the lesson, Silas. Let her earn her way back. That is the only way she will learn what love actually costs." I folded the letter and placed it on the table between us. Then I reached into my jacket pocket and set a small white card beside it. Plain cardstock, black type, the name and direct number of the Public Defender's Office for the Southern District of New York. "That is your lawyer," I said. My voice came out even and without heat, not cold, not warm, simply clear. "She is overworked, and she will not be able to undo the choices you made. But she is honest, and she will represent you fairly, and honest and fair are more than you have had from the people you chose to trust. I paused. If you cooperate fully with the federal prosecutor, there is a reasonable chance you avoid prison time. You will lose everything else. The assets, the lifestyle, the name you spent 3 years trying to earn. But you will be free. And free is something you can build from. Arabella stared at the card. A tear dropped from her jaw onto the stone terrace, and she did not wipe it away. She stood there for a long moment, with the ruins of everything she had chosen arranged around her feet, and the morning light coming in low and pale across the lake. And I watched her face as she moved through something internal that I could not see and could not help with a reckoning that had been coming for a long time and had finally arrived. Then she reached down and picked up the card. She held it against her chest with both hands, not dramatically, not with any performance left in her, just held it the way you hold something small when everything large is gone. Then she turned and walked back down the stone steps without another word, her sneakers crunching on the gravel as she made her way back down the long drive toward the gate. I watched her until she disappeared around the curve in the road. May came back out and sat down and looked at the lake for a while. "She took the card," May said. "She did," I said. May picked up her coffee cup and held it in both hands, looking out at the water. "That's something, Silas." "It's enough," I said. "For today, it's enough." The mist had lifted entirely off the lake by now, and the water was flat and clear and bright in the April morning, and the day had only just begun. I wrote the letter on a Wednesday in November. Not because the day was significant, not because anything had happened to prompt it, or because a deadline had arrived, or because someone had asked. I wrote it because I woke up that morning, and the words were finally arranged correctly, waiting to be set down the way things wait when they have been patient long enough and have decided the waiting is finished. The Hudson Valley in November looked nothing like it had in October. The oaks had completed their surrender. What had been burning red and gold 6 weeks ago was now bare architecture against a gray sky, the bones of things exposed after the color had gone. The lake was dark and still and entirely without ornament. I had been living out here full-time since September, and I had come to understand that the estate in autumn had a quality the summer version did not, a kind of honest bareness that suited the work I was trying to do, which was the work of figuring out who I was when I was not performing anything for anyone. I sat at the desk in the study, the one that faced the lake, and I took out a sheet of plain cream paper, not the heavy embossed stock of Apex Holdings correspondence, not the legal-grade paper that Jonathan used for documents that needed to feel permanent. Just paper. The kind you could find in any office supply store in any city in the country. The kind that did not announce itself. I uncapped a pen and I wrote my daughter a letter. It took 4 drafts. The first was too long, 3 pages that started with an explanation of the trust and moved through the decision to hide the money and the reasoning that had seemed so careful at the time and had produced such catastrophic results. I read it back and recognized it for what it was, a defense, a closing argument, the kind of letter a man writes when he is still more concerned with being understood than with actually reaching someone. I folded it twice and dropped it in the wastebasket beside the desk. The second was too short. 3 sentences that said what needed to be said in the most compressed and efficient way I could manage, that I had received the photograph, that I understood she had not known what she was signing, that I was not ready to see her yet, but that the door was not closed. 3 sentences that read like a legal document. 3 sentences that were accurate and completely inadequate. I threw that one away too. The third started this way I wanted it to start, and then became something else halfway through, something with an edge to it, that I had not intended, a residue of anger I had believed was finished, but apparently was not entirely. Not anger at Arabella specifically. Anger at the situation. At the 15 years of careful silence that had produced a daughter who was ashamed of her father's truck and married a man who used her as a legal instrument. At myself for the specific catastrophic miscalculation of believing that protecting someone from knowledge was the same thing as protecting them. I recognized the anger for what it was and set the draft aside without finishing it. The fourth I wrote slowly. I stopped often. I read each sentence back to myself before moving to the next one. The way you read something when you want to be absolutely certain it says what you mean and does not say anything you do not mean and leaves no room for misunderstanding in either direction. I told her I had received her photograph, the one she had sent with no return address taken from across a diner counter, her in the yellow uniform, mid-laugh head thrown back. I told her I had carried it in the inside pocket of a midnight blue suit for 6 weeks next to her mother's letter, and that both of them had been present at an evening in April that she had also attended in a different capacity in a different part of the room. I thought she would understand what that meant once she had the full picture, which I intended to give her eventually, when we were both ready for that conversation. I told her I understood she had not known what she was signing. Ray's investigation had been thorough. The timeline was clear. Bradley had understood the mechanism of the Foundation documents well enough to present them as routine administrative paperwork during a period when she was planning a wedding and trusting the man she was about to marry. She had signed in good faith. I knew that. It did not undo what happened. The federal record was what it was, and the restitution order was what it was, and she would be paying both of those debts for years, regardless of her intent. But knowing it changed something in the way I thought about her, and she deserved to know that it had. I told her that her mother had worked in a diner on Queens Boulevard for 3 years, that Mary had carried plates and refilled coffee cups and counted tips at the end of long shifts, and had never once in 3 years complained about any of it. That Mary had believed with a consistency that I had found almost unreasonable at the time, and had come to understand was actually the most sophisticated thing about her, that the life they were working toward was worth the one they were currently living in the meantime. I told her that if she was anything like her mother, which she was more than either of them had ever known, and more than I had been willing to say out loud, while I was still angry, she would come through what she was carrying and be different on the other side of it. Not damaged, different. The way things are different after they have been through something that tested whether they were actually made of what they appeared to be made of. I told her I was not ready to see her yet, that I did not know when I would be, that the honest answer was that I was still in the process of figuring out who I was now that I was done pretending to be someone I wasn't, and that process was slower than I had anticipated and required more quiet than I had expected. But I told her that I was done pretending the door was permanently closed, that what I had actually meant when I turned and walked away from her in the Plaza Hotel, and when I turned and walked back into the house at Hudson Valley while she stood on the terrace, was not that we were finished. What I had meant was that I needed time. That time had not yet completed itself, but that it was moving in the right direction. I did not write that I loved her, not because it was not true. It was true in the specific, complicated, unresolvable way that love is true between people who have hurt each other without intending to and are attempting to find their way back to something that existed before the hurt, knowing they will not find exactly that thing, but hoping for something that serves the same purpose. I did not write it because some things do not need to be stated to be understood, and because the letter itself, 4 drafts of it, the 3 that failed and the 1 that survived, was evidence enough. You do not write 4 drafts of something for a person you have stopped loving. I signed it Silas. Not Dad, not yet. That word belonged to a version of our relationship that we had not rebuilt yet, and I was not going to claim it before we had earned it back. But not Strathmore either. Not the formal distance of a surname, just Silas, the name she had known her whole life, the starting point. I folded the letter along clean creases and slid it into an envelope. I wrote her address on the front in the handwriting she had once known well enough to copy, with enough precision to withdraw $5 million from her mother's trust. The small slant of the S, the firm line of the T, the loop at the end that I had never once thought to consider a vulnerability until it became one. I pressed the envelope flat and set it on the corner of the desk. May was coming up from Queens on Friday with soup and no stated agenda the way May came to things. I would give her the letter to mail on her way back down. It felt correct that it should travel through May's hands. She had known both of us across the entire span of this story, had stood at her back fence and watched me burn 15 years of flannel in a fire pit, had sat on the terrace and said, "She took the card." Silas, that's something, and she had never once stopped believing that it would eventually lead somewhere worth arriving at. The letter passing through her hands felt like the right acknowledgement of that. I sat at the desk for a long time after it was sealed. Outside, the bare oaks stood along the shoreline in their November architecture, enormous and patient, and entirely indifferent to everything that had happened in the past 8 months. The lake was dark. The sky was the specific gray of upstate New York in late autumn, the kind that is not threatening, just present the color of a day that has made peace with not being anything other than what it is. I had spent 60 years building things that no one could see. Foundations poured in frozen ground. Contracts signed with rough hands across polished tables. An empire assembled in silence while I drove a rusted truck and lived in a house in Queens that was never quite the home it was supposed to be. I had made myself invisible for so long that invisibility had stopped being a strategy and had become somewhere along the way simply how I existed in the world. I was done with that. The letter was on the corner of the desk. The lake was outside the window. Somewhere in the city, my daughter was finishing a shift in a yellow uniform and counting tips and building something from what remained, which was less than she had imagined, and more than she deserved, and exactly what the situation required. She was in this way more like her mother than she knew. I picked up my coffee. I looked at the lake. I thought about Mary, who had understood from a hospital bed something that had taken me 8 months of burning and building and standing on stages in a midnight blue suit to begin to grasp that you could not love someone into becoming who they were capable of being. You could only build something real, tell the truth about it, and trust that the truth would find its way to the people who needed it in the time it needed to take. I was getting there. Not arrived. Not finished. Not healed in any clean or conclusive way. But moving in the right direction at 60 years old in a house I finally lived in, without apology, with a letter on the corner of a desk that said what it needed to say without saying more than that. That was enough. For now, and perhaps for a long time after now, that was everything. I have spent 60 years believing that silence was the same thing as wisdom, that hiding the truth from the people you loved was a form of protection, that making yourself small would teach the people around you to be humble. I was wrong about all of it. This is what I know now. Family Stories revenge begins not with a single betrayal, but with years of silence that allows the betrayal to grow unchecked. I did not speak the truth when it might have changed everything. I called it patience. It was fear. Do not do what I did. Tell the people you love the truth about who you are before circumstances tell it for you. Teach boundaries early. God sees what people hide, and in my experience, He allows consequences to arrive precisely when we have run out of excuses to delay them. Family drama. Revenge is never as satisfying as it appears from the outside. What I found on the other side of all of it was not victory. It was just the life I should have been living all along. If I could offer one thing to anyone watching, this: do not wait until the ice water hits your face to decide who you are. Decide now. Stand in that decision. The people worth keeping in your life will recognize it. The ones who don't, let them go. Family Stories Revenge is a warning, not a manual. If this story moved something in you, leave a comment and tell me where you are watching from. Share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you haven't yet subscribed so you never miss what comes next, thank you for staying until the very end. A gentle note: some upcoming stories contain fictionalized elements crafted to illuminate real human truths. If that is not the kind of content that serves you, please feel free to step away and find something that fits your heart better. No hard feelings, only good wishes.